We are now. All right.
Okay.
Meetings ago.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's the 11th meeting, but our very first virtual meeting of the Portland Clean Energy Fund. As has been our practice for the last handful of meetings, we're going to start with an opening inspiration. And James is going to provide that for us again today before we get going. Go ahead, James.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and those joining us virtually, which is everybody, and glad to see some number of participants. We are in difficult and kind of weird times, and I wanted to share a poem that my mother sent me about a week ago, and it's a poem called Keeping Quiet by Pablo Neruda. And this was written in a very different time, in the 1950s, kind of more during the Cold War, when there was also an existential crisis facing the world and a lot of uncertainty. And so while it definitely speaks to different hazards and different sort of space, there's elements of it that seem appropriate today. And it's I present it to you for reflection. All right, Keeping Quiet, Pablo Neruda. Now we will all count to 12, and we will all keep still. This one time upon the earth, let's not speak any language. Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. It would be a delicious moment, without hurry, without locomotives. All of us would be together in a sudden uneasiness. The fisherman in the cold sea would do no harm to the whales, and the peasant gathering salt would look at his torn hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars of gas, wars of fire, victories without survivors, would put on clean clothing and would walk alongside their brothers in the shade without doing a thing. What I want shouldn't be confused with the final inactivity. Life alone is what matters. I want nothing to do with death. If we weren't unanimous about keeping our lives so much in motion, if we could perhaps do nothing for once, perhaps a great silence would interrupt the sadness. This never understanding ourselves and threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth is teaching us when everything seems to be dead and everything is alive. Now I will count to 12. And you'll keep quiet, and I'll go.
Yay. Thank you. That was a good one.
Thank you all.
All right. So I just wanted to, before we get into the agenda, just go over kind of a few of the ground rules, how we're going to do things in this new virtual setting. For the folks who have logged on to the meeting, who are members of the public, you're going to remain muted unless you sign up for public comment. And how you sign up for public comment is just send a message to the chat box. The chat function is turned on, but it's one way, so only staff will be receiving those chats. So indicate your interest in providing public comment, and we'll kind of stack you up there. And then once we get through that list, if there is any interest in that, we'll go to the phones if anybody has called in and get public comment from the phones. Committee members are also able to use the chat function, but it is also only one way to staff, and we're only using it for reporting technical issues. We are using the hand raising and hand going down for committee members and staff to indicate when they would like to talk. But that function is not going to be available for members of the public, just like in a regular meeting. The public comment period is the only time. Sam, did you have something?
Yeah, Katie, what I wanted to acknowledge is I know that I'm seeing this from my end as a participant. When folks are providing chats, they have to specify whether it's to James, you, or June. And so I just want to, you may want to provide a singular point for the public comment.
Okay, yes. So I would say if you can send that to June, that would be great. So just send a chat to June, say that you want to sign up for public comment, and she'll send me a list of the names. If you're running into any kind of, if it seems like something isn't working from a technical point of view, or you're seeing something weird and you want to kind of help us troubleshoot that, then shoot those messages to James. Is that it, Sam?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to lower your hand then.
Perfect.
So the first thing that before I turn it over to Sam to kind of go over some updates and talk a little bit about operating in this new reality, but I just wanted to get the approval of the meeting minutes out of the way. I sent those out. They were a little bit late going out. We ran into some technical difficulties, so hopefully you all have had a chance to review them. But has everybody had a chance to review the meeting minutes? Any comments or edits needed? All right, well then we're going to consider those approved, and I'm going to turn it over to Sam. He's got a kind of a little list of things he wants to go over before we jump into the public comment and then into the major presentation portion of the meeting.
Great. Just first off, I just want to thank everyone for joining us here this evening in our first entirely remote web teleconference meeting during these unprecedented times. On behalf of the city and certainly the PCEF staff, I want to thank the entire committee and members of the public for joining. We sincerely appreciate your commitment to this work. I want to acknowledge also that the Portland Clean Energy Fund is an economic development tool focused on both community and climate needs. PCEF was designed to help folks get into green careers, reduce utility costs, and advance community wealth and prosperity with a focus on groups that have historically been disadvantaged and marginalized. As we see the immediate COVID-related impacts on the many businesses and their employees in our community, I want to remind folks that the nonprofit community, many of which serve those most in need, are not immune to these same impacts. Many have had to furlough or lay off their workers as their sources of earned revenue have similarly dried up, and for those groups and those they serve, PCEF is a critical and substantive economic recovery resource and will be relevant, particularly relevant in this year to come. So in time, we'll come out of this, I hope, stronger and more equitable as a community. And we'll work with you all, leveraging and strategizing with city leadership to think through how we play our role in this effort. I think today marks our first deep dive as a committee into a critical piece of the grant-making process. As we continue these discussions in the meetings to come, staff will note specific areas that are more responsive to these particular times we are in. And while at least now I recognize there's going to be an urgency to dive more into COVID-centered discussions here today, I'd ask that you all refrain until we as staff can better support the conversation. In the meantime, that said, please don't hesitate to reach out to staff directly if you have any thoughts, as these are conversations that we are rapidly working through. This is the first of this type of meeting, and 3 hours is what our typical meetings have been, and those are challenging. And so we knew that was unbearable in this format, so we shortened it to 2 hours. But at the end of this meeting today, we want to check in with you all to see how this first go went, recognizing it's going to have its bumps and starts, and we're going to try to figure out how we do this. But we're going to ask that you consider meeting more frequently so that we stay on our timeline of getting resources awarded in fall. And it's going to take a lot given obviously all these disruptions. This is certainly even more ambitious given the times that we are in. However, it's certainly, I think we'd acknowledge that it's that much more needed. Lastly, these changes do have an impact on public engagement, particularly those in our community so often left out of these processes. While we are thinking through alternative strategies, we have extended our public comment period and our draft guiding principles, and similarly expect to do so on future comment periods in order to provide more opportunity to comment. So stay tuned. We will be bringing those back to you all during our next meeting on April 9th. But I wanted to acknowledge that we are working through thinking exactly how do we create opportunities for those that are going to have a harder time, particularly this time, to engage with this, but recognizing that it's important. And at the same end, we want to make sure we keep this moving. So I think that's what I have for now. And I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Well, it doesn't look like anyone who is logged on is interested in giving public comment. June, would you unmute the phone lines and check if the 3 people dialed in on the phone? Is anyone on the phone interested in providing public comment? Okay, I think we can take silence as a no and go ahead and mute the phone line again. And so, Sam, I'm going to pass it back to you to talk about committee membership and nomination process.
Okay, so this is going to be short here. So as you all know, last committee meeting, Andrea, I know you were off the phone, but Andrea indicated that she would be resigning off of this committee in order to start up a recruitment for an individual that brings an Indigenous perspective to the committee, something that you all have communicated pretty loud and clear is an important perspective. And so what we are going to be doing this, so in the interim, there obviously there have been some shifts, but in the interim, well, I guess the hope originally was to come to you all in this meeting with a firm recruitment plan as the key entities that we would connect with just to talk through what that recruitment would look like. Ended up being busier than anticipated. We've only recently connected with them. So our plan is on April 9th, we are going to be bringing forth to you all a recruitment plan where it lays out sort of what the call for the recruitment is going to be, as well as a timeline for that recruitment, and then solicit ideally 2 to 3 folks from you all who would be interested in participating on a subcommittee to review that recruitment, alongside with Laura John, who's volunteered or at least said that she'd be willing to participate on the subcommittee. We've been in conversations with a range of folks just to kind of tee them up for the fact that this recruitment would be coming and get their feedback on what would be sort of the appropriate channels to do the recruitment, as well as get a sense of timeline. So we plan to bring that back to you all next week, and what it'll be will be generally the language that would be called out in the recruitment, like this is the type of individual we're looking for, as well as the timeline for the recruitment and what the review process would look like. And I hope you all can think in between now and next meeting whether you would be interested in participating on a subcommittee to review those applications so that we can make a recommendation to the broader body. So that's what we plan to bring you all next week. We will send that to you all in advance, but I wanted to make sure you all were teed up for that and knew that that was coming. I guess at that point, does anyone have any questions? Okay.
All right.
I hope you'll thank me for giving you back this time.
Yeah. So we're gonna move on. We're gonna move on with into the kind of major meat of the meeting today. And I would ask, because we have some folks who are just dialed in and not logged on, that when you talk, if I call on you, I'll say your name, but if you're speaking and I haven't said your name, if you could just indicate who you are, that would be great. So that the folks on the phone who can't see the screen know who's talking. So our subcommittee, the subcommittee on the grant application process and review criteria, is going to be actually delivering the presentation. So I'm going to continue to drive the advancing of the PowerPoint and try to keep up with their timing. We're going to try and get all the way through the entire presentation, and there's a lot of material. Hopefully you all had a chance to review the handout that was sent out and the PowerPoint that was sent out ahead of the meeting, because it's pretty dense and there's a lot there, and there are a million kind of rabbit trails that we could go down, all really worthy explorations that we will need to go down eventually. But for tonight, what we really want to try and do is get through the presentation and only at least for the first time, only stop for clarifying questions. So if there's something that you need to, that you don't understand what is being explained or what's being meant or what's on the slide, then we can stop for those kinds of questions during the presentation. But for conversation types of questions, we'd ask that those kind of hold until the end. So we're going to go all the way through the presentation, and then we're going to hop back up to some places where we're going to be asking for your feedback and using a polling function, and also have an opportunity for some conversation. So I'm going to turn it over first to Ranfeest, who has been one of our fearless leaders in the subcommittee. And get you on to slide 1.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you everyone for joining this meeting again for today. I'm going to try to provide some additional context and an overview for the presentation today. Again, I think as Katie noted, this subcommittee has been meeting in earnest since our decision to create the subcommittee back in December, having regular meetings starting in January. Much of the work in terms of doing the research, doing the due diligence around starting to develop the framework occurred during it in the past few months, especially pre-COVID-19. So just want to sort of provide that context, as we go in and just encourage patience as we as a committee try to adapt and think about how we move through. And so into the overview for today, was there a question? So I'll provide the overview next. And in terms of what we'll be providing folks, again, as Katie noted, we want to do a quick run through of the presentation. So please hold your questions if possible, but if there are any clarifying questions throughout the process, feel free to jump in and ask a clarifying question. We want to make sure folks understand all the different jargon and what we mean, and just in general what the framework that we're proposing here. In addition, I think some of the overview that we'll be reviewing in terms of the content today will be, session goals, agenda, thinking through, sort of thinking through what the ease of the application process is. So throughout all these parameters, we'll be providing feedback from the subcommittee to get a general temperature check, whether how folks are feeling, whether there's anything to add, delete, or suggest. So again, we'll be reviewing ease of application process, types of eligible funding, size of grant, scoring, review process, decision and portfolio process, eligibility, estimated review work, as well as who gets to review the applications. Again, these will be sort of some of the themes we'll be reviewing today, and we'll be looking for feedback from the committee, but I think in general we'll be looking for feedback for the public. Next slide. So again, who was in the subcommittee? So the subcommittee included Faith, Megan, Robin, and myself, staffed by Katie and Janet. Again, we've been meeting once a week since January. Some of the considerations we had throughout this process were researching, best practices. So we reached out to several funders, had one-on-one interviews or over the phone phone calls. Try to sort of get clarity and ease for applicants and reviewers. So we had some public workshops to sort of try to get some guiding feedback from different stakeholders. Developing guiding principles, which we have sent out for folks to the public for public feedback. Legislative, so what's in the actual draft of the ballot, knowing that these are constraints and making sure that we are following the letter of what voters approved back in November. Again, other considerations again were public comments. And so what we'll be reviewing again is just the eligibility, scoring, and grant review process. And again, I think, the methods that we used again were online research and actual interviews with actual funders. Any questions? So next slide. Again, so when developing this framework, we knew that year one would be different from year two. Some of the considerations, again, going into our framework for year one is we understood that there would be less funding to distribute. We understood that the timeline for building the program would be very scarce. So rushing to develop a program was definitely the urgency to make sure that we're getting dollars out, but knowing that it's difficult to build a grant program. So we knew that there would be going into a lot of uncertainty and that we would be learning. So I think we were courageous in getting messy and willing to make mistakes, knowing that we want to go through a process that have some values alignment, and that's, you know, that it's things that we can learn and refine moving forward. With that said, I do want to note that much of the framework we developed was pre-COVID-19. So I think for many folks who are on the phone call, you know, I do want to know, like, I want to sort of recognize that for many folks, you know, I think folks are really, applicants are really focused on maintaining their current infrastructure. So much of the framework we're developing, again, just to provide this context, was pre-COVID-19. So I think I'm looking forward to feedback, not just from our committee members, but from the broader public as we dig into. But I think in general, what we want to do is build on this framework moving forward for year 2 and year 3. So yeah, so thank you. So from here, I guess next slide, I want to pass it off. So last slide here. So again, we'll be reviewing the timing of applications, the ease of the application process, eligibility criteria, and components of the review process. And so I think next slide, and I think I'm going to hand it off to Robin.
Yep. Thank you. So I'll talk quickly about the timing of the application. As Ramfis mentioned earlier, you know, given the limited funding that we have for year 1, given all the learning and program development, you know, what we're you know, leaning towards, or, you know, what we're recommending is year 1, we have one review process, one application process for all types of grants. But that in year 2, we have multiple application rounds and possibly the notion of mini grants. These would be small grants with, you know, a very specific purpose and potentially minimal review process compared to larger grants. And some of the considerations that we went into as we're kind of deliberating all this is that one, you know, different technologies, different solutions, different applications have you know, different means for reviewing review process. They have a different review process, and so, you know, how you propose, you know, a solar installation might be very different from one that involves innovative technology. So we want to tailor the application process to the type of solutions or technologies that are being considered. Another consideration that we kind of factored in is that, you know, the applicants may have their own timelines that we want to try to accommodate. So, for example, some of the agriculture work or industries, you know, they're going to be very busy during the summer and the falls, and even in the spring. So it doesn't make sense for us to have an application deadline, you know, in August. So, you know, we might want to tailor the application process for those grants, you know, in the off season, let's say in the winter time. And then the last kind of major consideration that we incorporated is, you know, creating space and time for the staff to do the other work. And as I'm sure all of you can relate, this is our version of flattening the curve. If we just had one application timeline process per year, you can imagine that all the staff has to get geared up to review and sort through and, you know, engage with everything. And that's a lot of work. Whereas if we can kind of spread it out, you know, spread into 2 different application processes, you know, it gives staff time to manage the workload and you know, not have to go crazy. So the recommendation is that for year 1, you know, we do one solicitation. And then, in the process of building the program and learning, we will conduct research and bring back some recommendations on multiple funding cycles for year 2 and beyond. Any questions or clarifying questions on that? Okay, next. The other thing that we also factored in is the ease of application process. And understanding that our intended audience, the nonprofits that will be applying for this, have vast, different sets of backgrounds, experiences, skill levels with regards to applying for grants. And so we want to make sure that we're engaging all the nonprofits accordingly and not giving a distinct advantage or disadvantage to one versus the other. So things that we're going to be incorporating is timely communication, making sure that we're proactive in the communications that we're doing, being clear and transparent as best as we can. There's been talk about whenever applicable, we would put together a glossary of terms just so that people know and what the terms are, the consistent definition, and if we use acronyms, the acronyms are properly described. Another thing is effort appropriate to request. And, we'll talk a little bit later about, different sizes of grants and, the effort to apply, for example, for a $10,000 grant versus a grant that's, let's say, $1 million. There's going to be a different review process. And so the amount of effort that's required to go into the grant application process should reflect the amount of funding that is being requested. I mentioned earlier a little bit about consistent definitions. To be inclusive as possible, and understanding that some communities do not have experienced grant writers, or may not have access to it, or may have a language barrier. So we want to do what we can to accommodate all nonprofits. And so, for example, and this is just an example, we may allow for certain portions of the grant application to be submitted by audio or video recording. Allow for capacity building, and obviously allow for continual learning and improvement, both for us and for the organizations. Okay, next. We also talked a little bit about, and I think we'll dive into this more in the future, the different types of eligible funding requests. And this is kind of a comprehensive list of things that we may want to consider for funding. So that includes capital projects, programming, planning grants, capacity building and technical assistance, operating support, hosting or attending events. And this might be an example where some organization may want to send a staff or two to a conference so they can learn about some technology. We talked about innovation. Sorry, my screen is acting up here. I can't read the the rest of the. There we go. Grants allow for nonprofits to apply to provide business support, contractor support, different types of parameters and requirements based upon the size of the request, and also defining what is not allowed. So it's clear to people as best as we can communicate, what type of projects we're not going to fund with PCEF. Okay. And is this still me? Yes, okay. So another thing that we considered is the size of the grants. And, there is a wide range of applicant capacity to administer the grants. You might have a large nonprofit with very established technical staff, grant writing staff that can handle, a 6-7 figure grant. Or you might have a very nascent nonprofit with, a board of board of directors that are going to be applying for the grant, and they're obviously going to have more limited capacity. So we want to be able to have accommodate, both ranges, a wide spectrum of nonprofits, as well as accommodate a wide variety of sizes and project types. And recognizing that the legislation does support capacity building and projects for existing and emerging organizations. So the recommendation that we're moving forward, we like to propose is offer kind of mini grants, and the numbers are going to be TBD, but kind of give you an idea of mini grants, small grants, and large grants. And we've been referring it on the committee as kind of small, medium, large grants. That meets the different capacity and needs of the application. And that, again, the application and monitoring, the reporting requirements should be tailored to reflect the size of the grants. Yeah. So I think the next one goes to Megan, talk about scoring.
Yes. Assume you all can hear me. Good. Okay. Hi. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about scoring. And today we're not really going into the details. That will be for another meeting. But so this is just a pretty high level overview. And here's a few of the different kind of concepts or options we have been talking about. And the first one on their scale is just, we've been starting to kind of have a rough draft of criteria that would allow different types of measures to be defined in the same terms. And we're also trying to come up with like a range, like what it look like to score from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 or something like that. So this would provide sort of a more universal way we could assess projects for their commitment to social equity, for example, or whatever criteria we decide we'll have. So that's something we're still working on and we'll bring back to workshop at a future session. The second one on there is minimum score, and you can see the little chat icon at the bottom there is that this is something we'll want to get your feedback on later, is that we're talking about, should we have, the question, should we have minimum scores or like a threshold under which, if an application gets below that, it would not be considered further. So that's a question that we have for you all. Next, ranking. So, we're talking about the idea of ranking projects within different funding buckets. So for example, maybe within green infrastructure and ag bucket, or some of the other buckets, or within some of the size buckets or the type of project buckets. And this would just help us understand, we may have a lot of projects that do really well, that get high scores, but how do they do kind of against each other to help us kind of prioritize. The next thing on there we have, controlling for bias is something we've been talking a lot about. We recognize that all of us, anybody who's reading the grant applications or involved in that will bring their own kind of implicit biases. So we're talking about having maybe an overall training for all of us who are involved in that to at least get us all on the same page about how we might take kind of individual steps to try to combat our own kind of internal biases that we might bring. But another approach is just the whole process we're setting up to have multiple scorers, to have conversations with each other in ways to try to control for or have conversations about and then remove biases that might be showing up. So that's something we've been talking about. And then the last thing on here we have is inter-rater reliability, kind of jargony, but it just means that we all may be slightly different in our scoring. Like maybe I'm a very high scorer and I score everybody, above 90. Somebody else just scores across the board lower or bigger range. So inter-rater reliable, we're talking about taking measures to account for kind of those differences. So that could happen in a couple different ways. You could just have average scores, but then look at where there are kind of significant areas of difference. Or we could use a more kind of statistically sophisticated option using something called z-scores, which just helps identify where there are scores off of a mean, so that we can kind of identify where we all might be, where there might be differences in how we're scoring. I'm not saying that very well, but hopefully it's somewhat clear. It's something we're talking about and we haven't fully determined the process yet. Any clarifying questions before moving on? Okay, no, we'll move on to slide 18. So now I want to say a little bit about the review process, and this slide is just kind of outlining the overall process. Some of the future slides and also future sessions that we meet will go into greater detail of some of these. So today I'm only really talking about pretty high level again here. And this slide is really juicy and full of great stuff and full of jargon. So bear with me as I try to talk through it, and then it might be one we need to revisit later. But so the first step we have here is a letter of intent, or also called letter of interest, letter of inquiry. The acronym is LOI, or also called the pre-proposal. They're pretty similar concepts. And this is just a phase where applicants might submit something very short, not a full application, but just sort of their intent to apply. And we know other grantors use that. And the pro is that the applicants can get feedback, and the reviewers can sort of help them improve their projects early on and weed out maybe really, projects that just aren't going to be a good fit, or help them become a good fit. So there's some good benefits to that. A drawback is that it takes a significant amount of extra time on both sides, really. And we recommend not using this the LOI process in year one, simply for timing's sake, because our goal is to get funds out the door fast, and we have a lot of other things to sort out. It might be something we want to return to in future years. So we're kind of just bookmarking it for now. So where we would start this year is with the eligibility screening. So the second bullet there. And that really would just be a step, as the words say, to ensure the applicants are meeting pretty basic eligibility criteria. This would be a step performed by staff. And the criteria for that will be on future slides, so I won't talk about that right now. So assuming projects make it through a pretty, the eligibility screening, they would move into what's really the more substantive review. And we actually have come up with a series of steps within the substantive review. So they are, and by the way, the substantive review would possibly look different depending on the size and the type of the grants. Like, all grants over a certain dollar threshold might go through a different process than those under it. Capital grants might go through different than operational. So it's something we're thinking about, and we'll need to determine what those thresholds are for the kinds of different reviews they might go through. But okay, so then anyway, the different parts of the substantive review. The first part might be an initial threshold review. And this is something that we have in there shown as needed, because it's something we're not sure we'll need, but we are imagining we could get a very large amount of applications. And so if there are, we could utilize an initial threshold review done by staff before the next step below the scoring panel review, mainly to funnel from a really big number of applications that would have to a smaller number that would get this deeper substantive review. And the goal would really be to, for capacity reasons, et cetera. So that would be more than the review panel can handle. And this type of initial threshold review we found in our research is not uncommon. So organizations like Social Justice Fund use a staff screening review to reduce that number. And what we're proposing as a committee is thinking about implementing this only if the number of applications received is too big to allow for committee participation on scoring panels, beyond the hours we're anticipating having time to review. And we're also suggesting that the initial threshold review would be conducted by a minimum of 2 staff per application, not just 1 person, but 2, to sort of combat that potential for bias mentioned earlier. And another check on accidentally weeding out projects that might be great is that we also would form a subcommittee to conduct random checks on the scoring to confirm that that scoring is yielding outcomes consistent with what would be achieved if those projects had gone through a broader panel review. And then the committee would also, meaning this full committee, would receive a report with the characteristics of applications that did not make it through the threshold review and they did, so we could kind of understand if just the differences among those groups, if there are any, et cetera. So that's what that idea is. And again, we're kind of proposing it on an as needed basis. The second bullet under substantive review is the scoring panel review. And this is probably what you have been imagining when it comes to reviewing. And this is the part of the review process that would be scoring of proposals by teams that each team or scoring panel would include, or could include, I should say, some staff, of course, some committee members, so some of us, possibly some city subject matter experts, so their acronym for those is SMEs, and I think we're talking about that on a future slide, but this might be, you know, somebody from somebody reviewing a building proposal, bringing city code review panel sort of thing to it. And or possibly, sorry, and going back to who else might be on the scoring panel review, could be community volunteers. We'll talk more about that. But so the idea is that this would be a team review, and the, you know, the size of that panel would depend, you know, one goal would be to balance just the burden on everybody doing it and our overall capacity and operational logistics, but also with the goal and aim of reducing bias and giving a fair review and of diverse reviewers on all these reviews. So we're anticipating maybe teams of 3 to 6 people. And we all, you know, each member would review their scores, and then they would meet to compare scores and explore where there are applications with really different reviews. And if there were any need for clarifications from applicants, that could be allowed during this time so that the scoring panel review could review it. And then next, the last step in all of this, or maybe last step, would be a technical review. And some types and projects, some projects could need a technical review for things like building retrofits might need a technical review by a building science professional. A solar project could need a review by a solar professional to confirm indeed that there's good solar potential and that engineering thoughts like a load-bearing roof were thought through. And these reviews would be conducted by technical experts that are contracted to perform that review, or in-house staff where that's possible. So we show that here after the scoring panel review. And you know, the benefit to that is that we would only be contracting out or finding the resources to do that for projects that have made it through and are prioritized after all these other steps. But another option that we saw other grantors do is we could do it right after the eligibility screening, could come a technical review. And you know, the benefit there is then only projects that make it through a technical review or any information brought out during the technical review would be then brought to the scoring panel. So that's kind of where that would go in the process is something that we're deliberating upon. And I have a few more things to say on this slide. Next on here, we have due diligence. And this is we spent a fair amount of time talking about this in the subcommittee. And I'll try to just summarize, but the idea of due diligence is it's not really something that is a part of the scoring review or something that would kick an application out or in. It's more of a check by the grantors that the risk of a proposed investment failing is minimized, making sure that it typically explores a range of factors related to the strength of the applicant and their proposal. For example, an organization's financial management system, an assessment of their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, of their organizational strength or capacity, and et cetera. And so for many funders that we researched, you know, this is a chance to look for red flags that just might not be caught elsewhere. And it doesn't mean that an applicant would be disqualified. It just might be a place where we learn that PCEF needs to better help that organization be positioned for success. Like an example is if an applicant had some weakness in their financial management system, the funder could build specific requirements in to help them think through how to mitigate risk and build capacity in that area. So one thing we were talking about is we think our whole process has already built in a lot of kind of the due diligence review process that other funders do at other steps in the process. So we aren't as sure we'll need it because maybe we think we'll be getting that information at other times. So we're exploring whether this will be a necessary part, and if so, if this is when that process should occur. And then, you know, is this a time when, if a proposal is already past the scoring panel, but there are still questions, is this a time where then we would do additional verification with an applicant? So one thing we were talking about is new information collected after an applicant period is closed shouldn't be used for scoring because not all applicants get the same option to do that. So these are just kinds of all the things that came up in that conversation. And the last thing I'll just mention is mini grants. the thing to know is everything I talked about is probably way more complicated than we would do for mini grants, which would be much smaller buckets of funding. So if we would decide to do that, we might decide that they have a much simpler review process, maybe just made at staff discretion if certain criteria are met. Maybe we would form a mini grant subcommittee, or maybe the full committee would decide on those. And the timing for those could also be different. Maybe that would occur just on a rolling basis or quarterly or in parallel with other grant cycles. So thoughts on this slide, and what we'll want you to think about later is questions around who reviews and the due diligence part. And now I'm passing it to Faith, unless there are clarifying questions.
All right. Thank you,
All
Megan.
right, Faith.
Awesome. Can you hear me, Katie?
Mhm.
Awesome. Great. Katie, do you want to do a time check? How are we doing?
We're actually doing really well. It's
Oh.
7:46, so I think that we're plugging right along. Sam gave us a little bit of time back, and we have had no clarifying questions.
Great. I would encourage everyone to take a really deep breath. Because I, have spent the time with my wonderful subcommittee members, with Megan, Robin, and Ranfis, spent, really rolling up our sleeves and diving into the details and chasing the weeds and going down rabbit holes and having a whole bunch of fun, thought-provoking conversations about this. And even with all that background, this has felt like a lot of information to download and take up into this meeting. So I just want to remind everyone what everyone else has said, who's been part of this presentation, that this is not the last time you will see that. This is not there's nothing that is final. There is not there are some recommendations, but this is not a fully baked thing, and we will have an opportunity to wrestle with many of these details going forward. So I just wanted to assure folks of that. Where we are on this slide and at this point in the presentation is we've gone through all of the considerations we made, the parameters on what we wanted an application to look like. We've just talked about scoring, and now we're to the decision point. So how are we going to make decisions? And what we discussed as a team was really that for the decisions, there would be the full committee, that's all of us, would receive a summary of each proposal that included the review scores and any relevant technical scores and due diligence information. The applicants would also, so all applicants would also receive a copy of the review packet that included those scores. And all applicants would have an opportunity to provide a short written or video, possibly another kind of response. So not a rewritten application, but a response that then would go to the full committee. It could be part of the consideration, and it possibly might change the ranking, but it might not either. So in general, grants would be awarded based on the highest score, based on the eligibility requirements and the review process that we went through. However, there would be a deliberation, and there would be a need for some portfolio balance as well that may impact final awards. The points of deliberation would be recorded so that feedback could always be offered to the applicants, and also to demonstrate any kind of rationale, right, for any decisions that departed from the strict ranking-based grant awards. And again, reasons, and we want to be very, very transparent that if there was any reason to depart, that the committee decided to depart from the ranking, that we would have identified in advance and defined that clearly in the RFP. So it could be, and again, I've already mentioned, it could be based on what we received. There was some clarification that really made a difference in the ranking that we received from an applicant. And it also could be based on portfolio balancing. The portfolio balancing is, much of it is largely driven into the eligibility requirements. So it's not that we have to go through the whole scoring process and then at the end say, oh, we've got 100 really great applications for energy efficiency, but we that bucket is limited to this amount of funds. So we will have some of that built into the eligibility requirements. And also, I think I should note here that the code does require us to do this kind of balancing between funding buckets, and also, you know, it could also be based on where the projects are, the geographies that where we're giving grants, and of course, percentage of the projects that are serving frontline nonprofits, or frontline served by nonprofits, and also the energy efficiency, renewable energy projects, and that we've identified those, and that they're at least 50% benefiting low-income and communities of color. So there are certain code requirements. One of the really nice things that I think we've talked about in past committee meetings is that portfolio balancing can occur on a rolling average. It doesn't not have to all occur within each funding cycle. So that does give us opportunity to reserve some flexibility and to be nimble based on the application pools that we receive. Of course, never wanting to get too far out of whack, because it's eventually there's a reckoning, right? We need to match those to do that portfolio balancing. I'm sure that we will come back to some of that. So after the full committee receives this review packet and has done any of the kind of balancing and deliberation that needs to happen, we would recommend that slate of grants to the City Council for final. I will note that in the committee, in the subcommittee, we also talked about needing to come up with a process for contesting or for appealing decisions. And so we did not dive deeper into that, and staff is going to work with legal to define what that might look like. So we didn't chase that detail any further, but did note that that was probably something that we needed to consider. So grants, so again, just for transparency, of course, a list of the funded projects and the summaries and total awards would be made public. And we will come back to that piece of decision making. So this slide, the eligibility screening, says a whole lot. It gives a lot of bullets, but not too much detail. This eligibility screening would be done at the top of the scoring process, as you all know, and we just talked about. The potential criteria includes, of course, is this an eligible nonprofit organization? That's defined in the code. Is the application complete? Another easy one. Is the proposal eligible for one of the funding buckets, one of the specific buckets that we know that we can fund under PCEF? Does it meet the budget parameters, whatever those are that we've defined? Any restrictions given mini or max levels of funding? Greenhouse gas reductions. Does this reduce or sequester greenhouse gas emissions? That's of course for many of the funding categories a requirement, and for others, is greenhouse gas reduction anticipated, or could it be measured? So that, again, probably this would not be part of scoring, but would be a check. Is this likely to occur? And the same with equitable social benefit. Will the project provide an equitable social benefit? And again, not a score here in this eligibility screen, but confirmation that it will occur. Portland location, and we have had some clarification on this, and I will certainly ask staff to clarify if this comes up as a question, but we understand that projects and project beneficiaries must be located in the physical boundaries of Portland. Other requirements, US manufactured. So technology, solar and renewable technology is primarily US manufactured. Wage requirements, we know we have the requirement around 180% of minimum wage. Insurance, this is a strict one for the city itself, that insurance is planned for, in place, or is otherwise deemed not needed. And then there's a host of other things that we could require as part of eligibility. Compliance with IRS filings, labor violations, not that those things exist, but that they don't exist, OSHA violations, and so forth. We are not suggesting that we include others at this time. We haven't done a deep dive into that, but we did have a discussion as a subcommittee about wanting to keep the eligibility requirements as simple as possible to create as much room for innovation as well. So we will come back to this and take a temperature on what you all think of that. And the next slide, the next couple of slides, actually, we're gonna really staff did an amazing job of kind of doing some estimates on what is it gonna take for us to review this. And this is going to be particularly helpful. When we get to the end of this, we're gonna ask everyone whether or not they anticipate they are available to do, to be on one of these committees that is actually doing the scoring. So this, you can all read this slide as well, but the estimated review workload. So, you know, when we're making these decisions, we need to decide how much time is this going to take. And so it's estimated that 2 to 3 hours per application for staff to receive, screen, communicate to the applicant. It's potentially on the low side. Estimate 2 to 4 hours per person per application for the substantive review. And again, this is the scoring space where potentially committee members would be participating as well. But that 2 to 4 hours would be for every person. So all staff and city subject matter experts or whoever else we have doing that scoring. And then, Ranfis, is there something? No, you're just not on mute. Then there's an estimate, you know, if we need to do any due diligence, of course, that would be added on to that. And we'd have technical review and those would be contracted hours. So not within the scope of the people on this call, probably. So to get a rough sense of what that might look like, that is probably with 45 applications. So we're going to do this based on the next slide, whether it's 45 applications, what that looks like. And if we had 100 applications, what does that scenario look like? So with 45 applications and everybody on the committee was participating in that scoring, that would be 10 to 20 hours or like a half a week, plus the orientation and any kind of deliberation meetings. If that was only half of us or 5 of us that were doing those, it would look more like a full week or 18 to 36 hours, plus that kind of orientation and deliberation. And for staff time, we're talking 3 to 5 weeks per project. To prepare the summaries, not per project, for all of them, for those 45 applications. And if you look, of course, 100 applications more than doubles that. So if everyone on the committee participated, we're looking at 20 to 40 hours plus the orientation and deliberation. If only 5 did, then we're looking at 40 to 80 hours. And again, same with staff time increasing significantly from 4 to 12 weeks. So obviously, we'd have no idea, but those were estimations based on what we could possibly anticipate for this first year, 45 and 100 applications. Who reviews? Excellent. Sorry, I lost my place here.
Katie, you're not on mute. You're muted, I think. Sorry.
Sorry, Ranfis, did you have a clarification you wanted to chime in there? Your hand is up.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm putting myself on mute there. I just want, on the previous slide, I just had I don't know if it's clear for everyone, in terms of like volume, as we as a committee, as we're reviewing, Faith, I don't know if you want to explain like what, as we as a committee review applications, how does the volume of applications impact the work in terms of how we review applications? I'm not sure if that's clear for everyone, but just curious if you can elaborate what the potential impacts could be if we go with a low volume versus a high volume of applications to review.
Ranfis, I'm not exactly sure what you're driving at. Do you want to just go ahead and go with what you're driving at?
Sure. I think something maybe for the committee to think about is as we review applications, or depending on the different structures of how we review the applications, whether reviewing a low volume of applications is desirable or a high volume of applications. I think in my experience, generally folks want to review a high volume of applications, making sure that as a committee we're doing our due diligence to fund as much work as we can. However, you know, if you're like me reviewing, you know, after spending maybe like 5+ hours reviewing applications, just the actual quality and time you're able to give each application diminishes. So there's sort of an impact in terms of how sort of the patience or the patience endurance that we each have for each application dramatically diminishes after we start hitting a certain threshold. So I think these are just things that I hope like the committee are considering as they provide us guidance is, you know, what is preferable, a higher volume, a lower volume, and just what are the constraints associated with that. So sorry, I was just trying to highlight what the potential pros and cons are from this.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I guess I'll be maybe even more direct and say or offer my opinion on this, which is I really hope that the whole committee wants to participate in the scoring, because I think that will be more, we'll be able to spread the workload and also hopefully have more capacity then to add to this part of the review and decision-making process. Thanks for that, Ranfis. So moving on to the next slide on who reviews. I think that Megan actually covered this really well in the eligibility screen. We anticipate and we suggest that is staff. That does have the eligibility screen. The technical review, we would suggest again that we're.
Everybody, sorry, Faith, your sound just got a little different. Is everybody? Do I sound normal?
I think. Okay, I think we might have gotten it. I think we might have muted the other lines that were doing that.
Okay, all right. Sorry, Faith, go ahead.
Oh gosh, no problem. I sounded great to myself, by the way.
Okay.
So for this technical review, what I think we've talked about it, we talked about it at the subcommittee level, and I think we've talked about it at other points along the way, is just this idea that we would be able to contract that out unless there was in-house expertise, and in-house expertise being in-city expertise. The threshold review, again, as Megan suggested, to the extent it's needed, given the volume of applications we have, we would suggest that 2 staff members handle that review. And for the scoring panel, so again, this is that what we just went over about, you know, the impact of how many hours and things. That's the heart of this scoring and where we come up with the rankings. We would suggest that is a mix of staff, to the extent that there are city subject matter experts that we have. Again, I feel like we need to do that a little bit more, little check on that, just to make sure that we've talked about any kind of conflicts, and that we've anticipated that there's, that we have, you know, that we've all, as this scoring panel has gone through whatever bias concerns that we have, and that we're making that very transparent. So we're talking about staff, city subject matter experts, if any, committee members, that's all of us, right? Or some of us on each of these scoring panels. And we've talked about community volunteers. And so those would be additional community members. Is there another slide, or is that this last one?
There is.
Great, thank you. So we definitely want to talk about today and at future meetings how many committee members can review, how many applications per committee member, and this is something that Ranfis was just talking about. How do we manage the various scenarios regarding the number of applications? Again, something we need to talk about. And one of the recommendations, and we talked about this a lot at the subcommittee level, was that we don't recommend that in this first year that we invite other community reviewers aside from community members on this grants committee to review applications in year 1. That's where we landed. There was a number of reasons why, and part of it is knowing that we are essentially piloting this grant process in this first year with a smaller amount of money, knowing that, you know, looking at the code and thinking about what the mission and the reason for this grants committee to be representative of the community, and knowing that the staff capacity and knowing that we're not, we probably won't be to full staff capacity by the time we need to review all of these applications. So that was a consideration that staff asked us to think about. And the other thing is wanting to make sure this was not the only way in which community members outside of this grants committee could participate. So we want to be sure that we build that into other ways, but are not recommending at this time that we have additional committee reviewers on this grant scoring panel. And again, thinking that that could or may likely change in subsequent years.
Thanks, Faith. So this is the same slide that you saw at the beginning of the presentation that just has a summary of the feedback questions. And so it's about 8:05 right now. It's not about, it's exactly 8:05 right now. And we have about 45 minutes before we want to be able to give committee members, you know, an opportunity to talk about, to give closing comments and also talk a little bit more about kind of scheduling and logistics moving forward. So what we would like to do is to go through and use the online polling function in Zoom to get committee member feedback on a number of these slides. And I'll just sort of drive back to the slides so that you can be reminded of what was on them. And then we'll be taking just sort of a general temperature from kind of like, yes, this is headed in the right direction, to I have a lot of serious questions and reservations about this. And then I'd like to open it up to folks giving just kind of a popcorn, and by folks I mean committee members, of what their thoughts and ideas are on each of the slides that we're asking for feedback on. Some of them we have kind of specific asks, like we really want to get your thoughts on the purpose of due diligence, but some of them we just want to know, is there anything here, like what's your high level to add, delete, suggest? Are there things that you thought were really great or things that you thought were really terrible? So I'm going to go back to the ease
and
of
Katie,
application
this is Janet.
process.
Just to piggyback on that thought about the popcorning, just a reminder, we're not going to be able to have the deeper conversation or discussion about the ideas. We just want to collect those thoughts while they're fresh in your head or in your mind, and then there will be multiple other sessions where we start getting into the content. But this is our opportunity to take that temperature about whether it's heading the right direction and hear any of those thoughts of, you know, you might want to add this, or I have a question about this, or a suggestion, and we'll be capturing those, but not opening them up for a deeper conversation for tonight.
Michael, did you have something?
Yeah, I was wondering, I've been following along with this, with the long form version of this. Are we looking at the long form version as we take these temperatures, or just what's on the PowerPoint slide?
The long form version. I mean, the handout is just kind of complimentary. We just couldn't put all those words on the slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a couple minor edits from the version that you have specifically on the due diligence one. So the content that Megan shared is a little different than where that was going into the weeds on private foundations versus public grantors and whatnot, and just tried to focus on the purpose of doing due diligence and things, how we're trying to build as many of the due diligence questions into the actual scoring, so there's very little that one would need to do afterward, and so it really becomes what would we do due diligence on and where in the process, and how do we ensure that it's fair in the process. So I wouldn't rely as much on the text in that one specific area, but the rest of it's probably 95% the version that you have.
Any other questions before we open the first poll?
Yes, I have a question. I am happy to just add these questions to the list of things we talk about in the future, but I have a couple of questions on slide 13, the timing of applications.
Sure. If you don't mind, I mean, if you could just give them and maybe we won't discuss them in depth tonight.
Yes,
but
certainly.
Yeah, absolutely get them out.
Definitely. I think one question I have is, did the subcommittee consider in year one funding just one category? Understanding that we have this requirement to split the money over the course of all of the spending we do, but for the kind of to balance wanting to have a clear process for applying for funds and getting money out the door. I wonder if there would be some benefit to choosing one bucket and putting money there the first time. And the second question, to kind of just add on to that, is what about mini grants in year one that might help do some of the planning work that doesn't really rise to a substantive planning project, but might actually just really a small amount of staff support or hiring a consultant or something that would allow an organization or a group of organizations to prepare for an application in year two. So I think those are my questions on that one.
Those are great. Thank you. Okay, so on slide 14 is the ease of application. And first, the poll, which I think June is going to make pop up on our screens, is just kind of the general temperature. Now, if any of you can indicate when you see it, I'm not seeing it yet.
Not yet. As a reminder, this poll is just for committee members. Not yet.
Nope.
There it goes.
There it is.
Stop.
So the question, the sort of the indication, the ease of application, the temperature is this strongly on track, somewhat on track, some reservations, or serious reservations. If you don't see the poll, I know that Maria was having trouble seeing it earlier, just go ahead and send June a chat and she can record your temperature that way.
And if the pop-up is covering the slide, you can just grab and drag that over so that you can refresh your memory with the slide content or look at the handout that was sent.
Katie, and I would just love to clarify too, these are the items that we are tracking to determine whether or not this is whether or not we are addressing ease of application, not whether we have achieved all of these bullets, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're asking from the full committee is just, are we on the right track? Does it look like we're considering the right things, the right kind of high level categories of things? Or does it look like we're not thinking about it correctly, or there's a different perspective that might help? So it looks like 7 folks have taken the poll, and I think we should just probably go ahead and close it. June, you can show the results. So that was 63% strongly on track, 38% somewhat on track. That was a relative to the other ones, maybe a little bit of an easier one to get started with. I would like to ask though, if there are things that the committee members, either in the long handout that accompanied the PowerPoint or just in the kind of words that were spoken during the presentation, is there anything that jumped out at you that you had questions about, or that you think we should add, delete, or modify? Okay, then I think that we can move to the next slide, which is types of eligible funding requests. And just as a reminder, these are the kind of types of projects and programs that could turn into a PCEF grant, with the exception of the last few bullets, which are just kind of specifications about potential parameter and defining what is not allowed. So June, can you launch that poll?
And if you have any questions about the details, those are spelled out a little bit more in the handout that you have.
And just as a reminder for the public, this handout is posted to the PCEF website under the agenda for this meeting. So it's at the bottom of that agenda.
So just maybe give 10 more seconds for the rest of the committee members to participate. Okay, let's close that, June. Can we show the results of this one?
Are you not seeing the results?
Mm-mm.
So we have 3 for strongly on track, 2 for somewhat on track, and 1 for some reservations.
Yeah, we can see that it just looks like it's still going, but that's okay. We'll move on. So I guess the same question as the last slide. Is there anything to add, delete, or suggest for folks? Looks like Andrea.
We're not here in the process, certainly, but I wonder if it would be interesting to look at a separate process for reapplying for successful projects. If we have a number of job training projects that are meeting all of their targets, and we may set a different application process up for reapplying for that same exact project going into future years.
That's a good point. Anyone else? Renfrees?
I think, I mean, obviously on the subcommittee, I feel like we're on the right direction. I think the only thing that I'm kind of concerned about for year 1 is, does this still make sense in the context of COVID-19? I think for me, it's, how many groups will be really thinking about capital grants? Our groups be really trying to focus on operating support. So I think that's something that obviously, I don't think it's a question that we can answer within this committee. I'm really interested to hear from other committee members, but I think it's something I'm really looking forward to hear from the broader community, because my sense right now feels like it's trying to maintain our current infrastructure for how we train and train folks for clean energy jobs, and making sure that nonprofits aren't falling apart. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think I'm digressing, but those are just current concerns I have right now.
Is there anything else that feels like it's missing from this list?
Katie, I just wanted to echo that, just a reminder, I think, as Sam was directing us in the beginning, that maybe withholding the language of year 1 or whatnot. We know that we're in a different context right now, This is the piece that we've been working on pre-COVID, and it's going to need to be addressed at some point. And Sam and the team and senior leadership are daily thinking about what might things look like differently with the COVID moment. And we just wanted to hold that separate from tonight as far as this is that groundwork foundation for the program at that moment when we do get a little more back to normal, which will
Megan?
Hi, yeah, obviously I'm
And
on.
then you, Michael.
Obviously I'm on the subcommittee. I think I appreciated Andrea's question. We did talk a little bit about whether the first year we'd want to think more about planning grants. And so that's something I think is worth bookmarking. But also something we didn't have a chance to talk about in great detail as a subcommittee, but I think something we ought to is where like collaborative, like finding collaboration building, network building. And I know we heard from some organizations around like, what would be the word I want to use here? Kind of capacity building, but around social movement building or political advocacy. And I'm curious if we just didn't talk a lot about those as a subcommittee, a little bit around the final political advocacy. And anyway, so those are probably worth discussing further at some point.
Michael, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I was just wondering. I mean, in these strange times, have we been reaching out to our coalition partners and seeing what their situation is? Have we been getting any feedback? Because I think that it really will affect year one funding. I'm assuming that this is looking towards year two, year three, return to normalcy. But have we? Are we doing any outreach currently to any of our coalition partners?
Sam, can I ask you to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. I mean, so there's certainly been initial, at least, we've been in this stay-at-home situation for 3 weeks now. And so certainly in the first couple of weeks, I think there's a recognition. And I mean, I would say that our frontline community serving organizations and certainly some of our coalition partners and others we're in a different place. We've checked in with a handful of them, and but by no means I want to acknowledge that that's everyone. And some of the feedback has been PCEF is more important now more than ever. Make sure those funds are available on the other side. So that's in some of it. That isn't everyone. I can acknowledge that some of the other feedback we have heard is that no, we are going to have to lay off folks and we are going to be hurting. So I think we've gotten a little smattering of feedback, and so that's I think where we are. I mean, there's larger conversations now about what our broader engagement strategies will be with those organizations. So it's taken us a minute to sort of sit back, understand what this moment is and the implications for those organizations, and we'll certainly start probably connecting more with them in the weeks to come. So that's sort of a small sample is what we've had so far.
All right, well, let's move on unless there's something from anyone else. The next kind of slide that we wanted to get feedback on was slide 16, the size of the grants. And, oh, look at that. The poll is up, so if the committee members could take that quickly, that would be great. Okay. And we'll give 10 more seconds. So it looks like 3 people felt like we were strongly on track and 3 somewhat on track. Are there any comments on the kind of the concept of mini grants, small grants, or large grants as categories? Looks like Andrea and Michael. Andrea?
Well, I guess one is kind of a clarifying question. What do we mean by mini grants, small grants, and large grants? It's a little hard for me to answer without more information there, I think. And the other is, we're talking about the size of grants, but we're not talking about the length of time people have to spend the money. And I think for me, it needs to go hand in hand. So some conversation about how many years are we giving people to spend money. You know, as a mini grant has to be spent in 6 months, but a $2 million grant can be spent in 5 years, or like, I mean, I think I need a little more there. Michael?
I'm going to go on top of what Andrea just said. I'd like to know how multi-year grant making fits into this for small, medium, large, mini grants. I'd also like to have just some rough numbers. I'm sure the subcommittee's thought of what they look like. So I'd love to see some rough numbers in there as to what it looks like and what they think a small or medium or large looks like. It might be very different from what I'm thinking. And that's all.
Yeah, and I would note that even within the subcommittee, there are some very different ideas about what small, medium, and large meant. So, but that point well taken. Anyone else? So I think recognizing that without kind of speaking to the definitions of mini, small, and large, and potentially some of the different time requirements associated with each of those categories, it's difficult to have much of an opinion about them. Part of what we wanted to do is just affirm with the full committee that there was an appetite for having different sizes of grants, and that those different sizes would have different application requirements, reporting requirements, and those sorts of things. Michael, did you have another comment, or is your hand just still up? Oh, and you're muted.
So many buttons to push. My hand is just still up. I've got nothing else.
That's okay. All right. So the next slide is scoring. And if we could get a general temperature on the concept of scoring, the concept of having a minimum score for either certain criteria or an aggregate minimum score, and then ranking based on scores.
And please ignore the fact that it says size of grants. This is scoring.
Give 10 more seconds. Okay, so it looks like one person thinks we're strongly on track, and 4 indicated that we are on track. So I'd like to open this one up now to get really comments in general, if you think there's something to add, delete, or questions that you have, but also specifically about the idea of a minimum score. So maybe I can give you an example that that folks can react to. I used to administer a grant program that had a minimum scoring criteria for the technical portion of the review. So you had to, there was 100 possible points, and if you didn't get 20, you didn't get to even be scored in the other categories. Within PCEF, it could, and then there also sometimes are programs where you have to get a minimum aggregate score. So you might have a terrible technical review, but you do very, very well in the other kind of categories of scoring, enough so that you are able to pass that minimum aggregate threshold. So the question to the committee is there interest in having minimum scores for certain categories? Like, for example, I could imagine if you had 0 to 10 possible points for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the grant application, and you got 0. Would it be possible for you to be funded? So do folks have opinions
Katie,
about that?
And just one clarifying point, it could be that you have minimum scores for specific criteria like DEI or technical. It could be aggregate if you're on a 0 to 100 and you don't at least get 75, and it could be both those things. So you don't need to either or on those.
Mm-hmm. Michael?
I'd just like to say that I personally think that there's things that should have minimum scores, such as DEI, but I think that things like technical don't need minimum scores because sometimes organizations have really great ideas, but not the technical know-how, nor people with the technical know-how to implement it. And I think of that a lot in capital projects, where technical know-how might not be part of in-house for what the organization has.
Andrea? You unmuted yourself and breathed. No.
I did. I mean, it's interesting because I think that when I've done review for capital projects in the past, we've just basically started at the top of the scoring list and spent the money until we ran out of money. And we always ran out of money before we got to the bottom of the list. I've never been in a position before where we might not run out of money before we ran out of projects we wanted to fund in that cycle. And that might happen. We might have fewer strong applications in a category or in a funding cycle than we want to fund. And I think that's probably okay. It's probably better to not spend the money on a project that doesn't have the technical capability or doesn't have the leadership of communities of color, DEI communities, or DEI work in the organization. So I think for that reason, a minimum score makes some sense to me.
Faith? Faith, you're muted. Oh, go ahead.
I'm pondering still. I think that Andrea's response, I don't think I need to say anything more. I don't have anything further to add. Thank you, though.
Okay. All right, the next slide is about the review process and recognizing that there is a lot there on that slide. We just still are going to ask you to take this poll that kind of gives us a general sense of if you think that the work is on the right, heading in the right direction, or if we need to stop and really consider some alternative views. Give it 10 more seconds. Okay, so it looks like 3 folks strongly on track and 3 somewhat on track. Oh, it changed. 5 somewhat on track and 3 strongly on track. I'm going to open this one up for comments, just sort of general feedback, but specifically we were interested in hearing from from the rest of the committee who is not on this subcommittee, hearing their feedback on kind of the question of who reviews and also on potentially on the purpose of due diligence.
Katie, I think there was also some interest in hearing about the threshold review, or no? Am I misremembering?
Yeah, I don't know. It did, certainly, if anybody has any kind of, I think that is a good question and maybe consistent with what Ramses brought earlier. Does everybody feel like they understand when that would happen and why? You could nod. No. So, I mean, the basic idea is just that if there were, say, 5 committee members who were serving on scoring panels, and we got 200 applications, that it wouldn't be possible to have enough committee members to be on every scoring panel. And so we would somehow need to kind of like winnow that pool of applications that go onto the full scoring panel down. So that's the where we were suggesting that there be a threshold review, which would look a lot like, you know, an initial scoring by staff, you know, of specific criteria that would be agreed upon by the committee. Other thoughts on either the threshold review, who reviews, due diligence? I know this is all pretty, this is new information from the subcommittee to the rest of the folks, Michael, Jeffrey, Shanice, Maria, and Andrea. So, we would love to get some guidance or just some reaction from you all so that we can kind of iterate in the work that the subcommittee is doing. Michael?
Oh man, I'm talking more in this meeting than I ever have. I'm going to start on the easy end of this whole thing, which is the mini grant making process. I do like the idea that the staff has discretion over mini grant making, and that perhaps it gets reviewed by the committee in bulk. So maybe every 6 months we get all of your mini grant applications together, and a subcommittee or the committee can review them just to make sure we're doing our due diligence also, and that you're on the right track. Not that we'd ever take a grant back or anything, but that we say, yeah, no, this is going well, or here's where it's not going well.
Yeah. Oh, so that was the easy one. I thought you were then going to move on to the harder ones. No.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the next slide then.
Oh, okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess my concerns are going to go with are going to appear again in slides 21 and 22, which I think have a lot to do with these two, right? Which is the workload. So who's doing what work for the workload, right? And who's got 40 hours to put in over a 2-week period, and who has 20 hours and who has 10, which I think is, you know, like whose responsibility are these is going to make a big difference in slide 20 or 21 and 22.
Yeah. Shanice? Oh,
Sorry there, my mouse just died. I think I'm resonating with where Michael is at. I think questions that are coming up for me are the different types of grants that it sounds like that we're thinking through: small, mini, large, how much might be allocated to those, how many we might be engaging in year one versus next year. And then I think that really makes an impact on the review process and how much time to each kind of scoring takes. And yeah, I think I'm resonating with the idea of maybe understanding the letter of intent is a process that might take a little bit longer. So I appreciate being able to sit with that. And yeah, I guess I'm thinking about the kinds of applications and folks. We're saying that folks can only apply to one in the first year. And I guess it's hard to dissociate completely from the times that we're in, but I'm feeling like that should be something that we revisit. And in addition to just like what we're trying to accomplish here, just making it easier and more accessible, right, for everyone. And I'm just trying to add up the numbers in my head. Okay, we got 100 applications, and if we go for small grants, are we going to use it all? So those are just questions that are coming up for me.
thank you. All right, well, let's move on to the next slide, which is slide 19, decision and portfolio balance. And if we could get the poll up on that one. So just as a reminder while that's happening, that the applicant response that we're talking about here is when after the projects have been evaluated by the scoring team and those sort of, a summary is written up, that summary goes not just to the committee, but also to the applicant, and then the applicant is given an opportunity to provide a response that the committee can then also consider. Let's give it 10 more seconds. Okay, and if we can close that one, looks like 7 are say that we're pretty close, and 1 indicated some moderate revisions. Anybody have anything to say about this slide? Okay, well, let's move on to eligibility. Sorry, Megan?
Yeah, again, knowing I'm on the committee, I've already had a chance to think about this a little, but just wanting to share that I'm still like thinking about this. When maybe, I'm sorry, I might be previewing knowing what we're going to talk about in the future, but that giving feedback to grant applicants and then having the, the applicant response thing. I like the idea a lot, but I also have caveats about how it's going to work in practice, like getting reactions and like, what if we don't get them from everybody and now we have this like uneven information, and like some organizations just may be able to respond more quickly or more thoroughly or more professionally, or I don't know. So I guess I'm just like, that's for me something we're going to really have to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't raise my hand, sorry.
That's all right.
I don't know where my hand raising thing is. Oh, it's hidden behind a pole. I read this several times. I'm still not sure what it means. I think my biggest thing is like, I don't really know what this means. I don't know if we're saying, I feel like it's a lot of words to get at something, but I'm not sure what it's getting at. I'm not sure if it's saying that we can push lower scores higher because it's not the Ronald McDonald House, but it's a local grassroots organization, or if this is saying that we should do a minimum amount of frontline serving nonprofits, because that only needs to be 20%, but the other 80% can go somewhere else because the portfolio needs to be balanced. I'm not sure what this is getting at. Sorry.
So, oh no, I appreciate that. And Ranfis, I think, are you going to take a stab at explaining this? Because your hand is up.
I mean, you go for it. I wanted to just provide.
I just wanted to acknowledge that this is the messiest part of the process, this portfolio balancing, and just note a couple of the things that are in there are directly from the code. So it's at least 20% of grantees of grant funds have to go to organizations that have historically served, I forget what the exact verbiage is there, and at least 50% of clean energy project funds have to benefit low-income and communities of color. So, and then there are the funding bucket targets that are also from the ballot initiative and are now enshrined in the code. And so what the committee can do is essentially what you said, which is deviate from the ranked score. I mean, we hope to build as much of into the scoring process as possible that you wouldn't have to do that, right? Like that if an application came in and it was providing benefit to low-income communities of color and meeting GHG and all of those criteria, that it would score well, and so you wouldn't have to do any kind of shuffling around. But it still could be that after 3 years, you find that you have only used 5% of funds for green infrastructure and regenerative ag, and you need to maybe do a little bit of balancing in that regard. Sorry, Ranfis, that was kind of a long explanation. And then Faith.
Well, Katie, actually, we were just going to do a time check since we were on task with that, and given that we're a little bit 8:45, and just suggesting if we can work our way through the rest of the slides. This is big and it's complex, and we're just trying to get that temperature and hear what are the things that we need to dive into. But I want to respect people's time, and I know there's a couple things we still have to get through.
Does that work for you, Ranfis and Faith? Okay. So the next slide is the eligibility screening. If we could get the, yep. Just 10 more seconds. All right, let's close that. So it looks like most folks felt that we're somewhat on track as a subcommittee, and at least one strongly on track. Any feedback quickly on this slide? Items to add, delete, suggest?
Under wage requirements, I'd like to see licensed employees getting prevailing wage. Anybody that requires a state license.
All thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so the next slides don't have feedback on them, but or the next slide, because it's just building. Slide 21, which is the estimated review workload, and then slide 22. So the real question here is do you think, does this make sense to you? We're not asking, do you as a committee member, although we will be asking that, but we're not asking, do you as a committee member have the time to commit to this, but more does kind of what's the committee's preference in participation in the substantive review, like Ranfis was saying, a larger number or a smaller number, given this time commitment. Does that make sense? I actually feel like maybe I don't know what the question is on this one.
There's supposed to be a poll that had the numbers and how many hours you felt comfortable. Did that poll question get deleted? Like the poll questions have been a little bit off on some of these.
So I think that this
next slide?
It's not the next slide. Sorry, you guys will just have to be slightly patient with us. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I'm just gonna maybe ask folks to send that via the chat. And Maria does have her hand up, and I will get to you in just 1 second. But if folks can kind of send via chat, recognizing that only June will see it, just send directly to June.
And the buckets are in your handout. So the temperature question that said what the hours were, like up to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, those are in your handout, the increments that should be showing up in the poll.
Or if you're not available to do any, just indicate that as well. So Maria? Oh, there you are.
Thanks for letting me jump in. Like Michael said, I don't know how to disable the hand raising function now, but I think this will be my only comment for now until I chat something else. But I am just overall curious about other ways we can continue to reduce the mystery around applications. Overall, I think we're on track generally, but I wonder if we could have a better estimation of our workload and be more on target if we do bring in, for example, the LOI and we create things beforehand to create more clarity and create a higher quality of application pool and find a way to entertain the most applications possible in the end that are most competitive. So I'm still trying to assess all of these elements all together, but I feel like there are adjustments in the beginning of the process along with technical assistance that will help applicants feel like they're most competitive, and that we take a temperature check early on what type of support we'll need to provide and how much time we get ahead of time so we can take time off from work or maybe contribute more to the review process if we can get that heads up sooner. But I can prepare time to be part of that, but it might help to think through some of the early phases of the application and talk to community, like Michael said, and other folks to find out how this pandemic is impacting people or changing their perceptions around applying and what their expectations are. So we can spend more time on an LOI, for example, if that can help us cater to our applicants with better technical assistance and then alleviating the application workload later on.
Anyone else want to comment or on either what Maria just brought up or kind of just on the potential work of the committee as part of a scoring panel? Jeffrey?
Yeah, I guess my question is, What is the timeline for these applications? Is it going to be from a couple weeks to maybe 4 weeks? I mean, that obviously depends on how much we can stretch that time over the amount of days that we have to actually review it. So I'm just curious as to what's the timeline we're giving the committee members to actually review these applications.
I don't think that anything is really, I mean, obviously nothing is set in stone because you all would have voted on it if that were the case. But conceptually, I think the subcommittee and staff have been talking about kind of about 4 weeks for review panel to, or for the scoring panel rather, to be able to do their initial individual scoring, then potentially get together as a group to discuss, especially if they have really divergent scores, and then potentially also get a simple clarification if that's needed from an applicant, and then finalize those scores.
Sorry, one last thing. So with that context, we're supposed to send a chat to June on how many hours we think we can give with that. I guess estimate for now, 4 weeks, what you're saying.
Yeah, and no, we obviously, we won't hold you to it, just sort of a general indication of if you're interested in being on a scoring panel and you feel able to be on a scoring panel and kind of to what degree. I would note that it is, I mean, there are some committees that sit on scoring panels and do this work. There are other committees like you guys or that are sort of structured similarly who only provide upfront guidance and then monitoring and don't sit on the scoring panel. So I think if you are able to do that, given your schedule and everything else that's going on, then that's great. And if you're not, then we just will need to kind of structure it so that those who are able to and interested can, and don't have to work 80 hours a week during that 4-week period.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Maria, I'm going to lower your hand. Is that okay? Okay. All right. Well, we are at 3 minutes until 9. Oh, Shanice, I'm going to let Shanice, I'm just going to let you go. Please.
I'll be quick. I think I'm in a similar place. I think for me, work visioning my kind of time commitment for this work, I'm willing to kind of take vacation or whatever that looks like as well, and having some clarity, and especially on the kinds of grants and how many an organization can apply to, I think will really help us with estimating how many applications we'll have. So I think those questions are something that I will ask us to circle back around to. And the application review, I think, as it stands, seems like it makes sense.
And before I turn it over to, well, I wanted to ask if any of you had closing comments. I will say this one thing real quick, though, about the kind of the unknown of how many grant applications we're going to get. One way to control for that is to have a threshold review, whereby even if there's 50 grant applications, then they all go to scoring committees potentially that have committee member participation. And if there's 200, still only 50 or whatever kind of we determine or with you is you have the capacity to be able to score. So I just wanted to make sure that that was thrown out there as well as kind of one way to be able to more accurately plan for how much time you might be asked to give to this process. Does anybody have any closing comments? I know that we had said that at the end of this meeting, we were going to talk a little bit about schedule. We have 1 minute left. And one of the things that we as staff had talked about was the potential to schedule more regular meetings for shorter amounts of time, just like more frequent but shorter. Can I get just sort of like a hand raise if folks are open to that idea, and it's okay if you're not? Do folks feel willing to or able to meet more than twice a month?
And for shorter time periods, so taking the 3 hours down, but meeting a little more often. Is that right, Katie?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was just clarifying that you meant, did you mean a hand raise in the like, well,
Oh, I did. I meant the like raise your virtual hand. Yes. Okay. Oh, I feel the peer pressure happening. So I think that maybe, Sam, what we should do is send out, is kind of reconnect the staff and then send out an email with some options for how to be able to move through the work that we need to get done to be able to get the solicitation out the door.
Okay.
Did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I guess what I'd like to do is please just give us feedback. This is the first of this type of meeting, and we'd love to know how to make this better. I apologize, we meant to give you all a break in this. And so just let us know how we can, so that's something I will commit to next time, giving you all, I'll make sure we have that in there, giving you all a break somewhere in here, but let us know how we can make this better. And we'll certainly be just connecting back as staff and teasing out how we, and likewise for folks that were on the call, members of the public, please let us know if there are ways that we can make this better on your end as well. And just send that feedback to cleanenergyfund@portlandoregon.gov. So really just appreciate you all. I know there's hard times, and it's really important that you're all able to make this happen. And so thank you.
All right.
That's all I have.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Have a great night.
Thank you.
nice
All right,
to
we'll
meet you
talk to you
all.
soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks, folks.
Live as we
Bye.
can.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.
Bye. All right. We're losing them. This feels like the cleanup crew.
I know.
All right, I'm gonna hit end meeting for all. Thanks, everyone. Good night.